Good morning, and welcome to our live webinar entitled Using Literacy Screening Data to Support Students with Reading Difficulties. My name is Donna Merritt. I am a consultant at SERC, the State Education Resource Center, and I will be moderating this webinar today, which is co-sponsored by the Connecticut State Department of Education. Our CSDE colleagues and collaborators are Dr. Patricia Anderson, a consultant at the State Department of Education, Academic Office, Bureau of Special Education, and a school psychologist. Dr. Anderson coordinates the state's SLD Dyslexia Initiative and is the department's contact person for this initiative. Our second collaborator is Joanne White, also a consultant at the State Department of Education in the Academic Office. Joanne is a state leader in the area of literacy and supports general education teachers throughout Connecticut in developing core reading curriculum and tiered interventions. As we get started, you should see on your screen a survey question that will help us to capture the breadth of our audience. Please take a moment to respond to the question, which will be the only one presented during the webinar. You should have received an email guiding you to SERC's website to access the PowerPoint for this presentation, as well as handouts that illustrate a diagnostic question model and a decision tree for reading. Other handouts and links can also be accessed at this site. This webinar will be archived on SERC's website, www.ctserc.org, in approximately 1 week. On the SLD Dyslexia page at SERC's website, you can also access additional resources pertinent to our topic. We will be fielding questions throughout the webinar. You may submit a question at any time by typing it into the GoToWebinar control panel. We will pause at a midpoint in the webinar and at the end to address questions. Dr. Margie Gillis is our featured presenter today. She is the president of Literacy How, Inc. and a research affiliate at Fairfield University and Haskins Labs. Dr. Gillis is nationally recognized as an expert in reading development and reading disabilities, including SLD dyslexia. She is the former president of the Connecticut branch of the International Dyslexia Society and is also a certified academic language therapist who currently provides professional development for teachers and consults in many Connecticut schools and with students and families. You will receive an email later today that will ask for your evaluation of this webinar, and we will remind you of this at the end of the webinar. We will value your feedback. And so, without any further ado, we're going to turn it over to Margie Gillis, who is our presenter today. Margie?
Thank you, Donna, and thank you all for joining us this morning. And I'm just going to jump right in because we have so much to cover this morning, and I hope that you all have the PowerPoint slides in front of you. For those of you who have heard me present, I'm not a fan of reading all the bullets. I know that you will do that later because I do have a lot of information to cover. So just to do a quick overview of our objectives for today, we're going to look at patterns of reading difficulty based on assessment data that we'll review and talk about understanding what reading screening data tells us, how to use informal diagnostic reading assessments as a means of digging deeper and learning more about our students. And then we're going to talk about what structured literacy methodology is all about, something that we might provide for students who need additional instruction in Tier 2 or Tier 3. And finally, we're going to talk about progress monitoring associated with those elements of structured literacy. I often start my presentations by talking about the simple view of reading. Many of you have heard of the simple view. It's a formula that you can see on the left side of the slide that says that listening comprehension times decoding equals reading comprehension. And this is an important concept that we're going to keep revisiting today as we discuss different profiles of students that have difficulty with reading. So on the next slide, we see Hollis Scarborough's Strands of Early Literacy Development. Again, many of you have seen this slide, and it takes the idea of the listening or language comprehension times decoding or word recognition equaling skilled reading. This is a very important concept, and very notably, language comprehension times decoding or word recognition equals reading comprehension. Why is it the product of the two and not the sum of the two? It's the product of the two because if you have great language comprehension but you can't decode, your reading comprehension is going to be 0. So 1 times 0 equals 0, right? If you have great decoding but poor language or listening comprehension, the product is going to be 0. So we need both components to be a skilled reader. And if you look at this slide and see that the strands can be separable and looking at those in the early grades, but they're woven together as children become more proficient. So we again see the D times the LC equaling reading comprehension. And then at the bottom here, we can see that roughly around 3rd grade, all of those strands are getting woven together in this, what we call skilled reading, the fluent execution and coordination of those word recognition decoding skills, along with the strategic metacognition that's required for skilled comprehension. If we place the idea or think about that idea now and put that into a table or a grid, and if you look at the top of that table, looking at phonological skills, which would be either you have good reading or good phonological skills, which would mean good word reading or poor word reading, and then on the left side of that table, non-phonological or language skills, that top of the braid, that language comprehension, you might have poor comprehension or you might have good comprehension. And again, this is simplifying this simple view. We have 4 scenarios, right? We have, and we're going to talk about each of those. We really don't have to talk about the skilled readers per se because we're talking about children who have reading difficulties. So we're going to look at the bottom left as the first scenario. That's the student with specific language disability / dyslexia / reading disability, and I'll talk more about that profile as we go along. In the top right quadrant, we're going to talk about the students that have the specific comprehension difficulties. That means that they have good word reading skills but poor comprehension. And then we're going to talk about the top left quadrant, which is the student that has a mixed reading disabilities. That means that they have difficulty with word reading as well as comprehension difficulties. And these patterns of reading difficulties were actually addressed in the Connecticut LD guidelines back in 2010. So you see that bottom left quadrant, like I just mentioned, as the specific word recognition difficulty category or profile. Those students might be non-alphabetic word readers, right? They may not even have the alphabetic principle. Or in the second bullet, they might have the alphabetic principle, but they're inaccurate readers. Or they may be in the third bullet, the student that can read the words accurately, but they're not automatic yet. They're not fluent with that word recognition. Okay, and we'll talk more about that profile. And then the second group, the specific reading comprehension difficulty group, where they might be non-strategic comprehenders, which means they're very, very poor at applying comprehension strategies, even at a listening level. And or they could just be suboptimal comprehenders. And then the last group that we're going to talk about are those students that have problems with both word recognition and comprehension. So taking that a little bit deeper, that first category of students that have specific word recognition difficulties, these students have at least average listening comprehension and oral vocabularies. That is a strength for them. Their problems really lie in the word recognition domain, and those problems usually center on phonemic awareness and decoding difficulties. It also means that they're going to have difficulty with fluency. And again, that could be because of inaccurate reading and or non-automatic word reading. These students' difficulties usually emerge early. That means in K to 3. Specifically and most notably if you're using universal screenings to find those students who are at risk. We refer to these students as having SLD/dyslexia. The next profile that we're going to be talking about are those students that have at least average word recognition difficulty, at least average word recognition skills and phonological processing ability, but they have reading comprehension problems that involve oral language comprehension or oral vocabulary knowledge difficulties. So we refer to these students as having specific reading comprehension difficulties. These students do not have a history of early decoding problems, although they may have fluency problems that tend to be based in language. And that can happen if you're reading and you don't know those words, you don't know what those words mean, or you don't have good comprehension or inferencing or whatever is implicated in comprehending text. Fluency is going to be impacted. So we may see some fluency problems, and we'll discuss those in a little bit. Often these students don't emerge until later in schooling, and that is because comprehension is really ramped up, right, in grades 3 and beyond. So we might see these children emerging at that point. And then the third profile that we are going to talk more about are those students with mixed reading difficulties who have problems with word recognition and phonological processing. They also have poor reading comprehension, but it's usually only partly accounted for by decoding. They have poor comprehension even in texts that they decode well. Their oral comprehension vocabulary is often weak. They also have difficulties with fluency because they're not solid with their decoding, and their language comprehension is also weak. These students tend to emerge early in schooling due to the problems that are persistent across the two domains. So one of the texts that I read most recently, and I highly recommend it, is a text written by David Kilpatrick, and you'll see that in your references at the end of the PowerPoint. The title is The Essentials of Assessing, Preventing, and Overcoming Reading Difficulties. It's just got a tremendous amount of wonderful information. One of the things that I excerpted from this text that I think helps us to understand this whole concept of using data to understand what the students' difficulties are and to dig deeper is this flow chart, if you want to call it that, or decision tree. You have this as a separate handout. I know you can't really see it very well here, and I'm not asking you to read the details at all. In fact, this is something I hope you'll come back to and look at in greater detail later. But what I want you to sort of be aware of with this flow chart is that it's based on 2 questions that are based on the simple view. So the first question is, if reading comprehension is a problem, would the student understand it if you read it to him? In other words, is his listening comprehension good? And the second question that follows is, depending on your answer to that question, does his oral reading seem effortless? So we're looking at fluency as the follow-up question. You're going to see this again in another decision tree later. But here we can see this in a closer look at this at the top half of this decision tree. And again, you see the first question, and your answer in this case is yes. Listening comprehension seems to be strong, seems verbally strong in the top top box seems verbally average to low average, and then you follow up with that second question about the oral reading. And then you get answers to those questions. The student might be a compensator, the student might have dyslexia or be diagnosed with dyslexia. You can also see there might be issues related to attention and working memory. So again, I won't spend a lot of time digging into this. I hope that you find it valuable as we go through this webinar, and then later on as you're talking with your colleagues about how to apply the methodology here. So since we're going to talk a lot about assessments as we move forward in this webinar, I just want to do a quick review for those of you who may not have this as background knowledge. 4 types of reading assessments, and you see those 4 types: the outcome, the universal screening, the progress monitoring, and the diagnostic assessments, a description and how those are used, and our purpose. And I love the medical model here to help us understand the purpose. We always want to really think about, why am I assessing? Because we know that we do a lot of assessments. We must understand the purpose. And you can read through this later, but you'll see that on in the left-hand column, I've bolded 3 out of 4 of those types of assessments, because we're going to focus on those 3 as we move through the webinar. I also want to point you all to the assessment resource guide, which all of these links are active. So if you are looking at an electronic copy of this PowerPoint, if you click on assessment resource guide, it will actually take you to the resource guide, which is a wonderful document that includes assessment options for reading related component skills listed by domain. And it has 2 appendices, one that has a glossary of terms, which we all need to know what our terminology means. We have to make sure we have the same understanding of those terms. And then a list of assessments, and again, those links are active and will link you to a website for each of those assessments. So that will be a very valuable resource for you as you do more of this assessment guiding instruction. And then I also want to point you to the K-3 Universal Screening Assessments. And again, this is an active link to take you to the approved menu of K-3 Universal Screening Reading Assessments. And you'll see that menu of options that was put into policy a couple of years ago. And what I want you to just notice is the last sentence is really important. Students identified as being at risk through universal screenings may require further diagnostic analysis. And that's what we're going to spend the lion's share of this webinar talking about. You have universal screening data, and what is it telling you, and when do you need to dig deeper to learn more about the students' instructional needs. So just a little bit more about universal screening. Most of you know this, so I'm not going to read all of this, but I'm going to highlight just a couple of important points. These universal screenings are provided for all children. We're determining the health of the student, right? And sometimes, we don't get enough information, we need to dig deeper, but these universal screenings are the important first point of departure. These measures have to be considered reliable and valid. They have targets called benchmarks or goals, and we have 2 examples here that are on the State Department menu, the Dibbles and Ames Web. Mentioning here that these screening measures result in false positives. Sometimes kids will be identified and they just had a bad day, but they're really okay. So you always have to follow these up and make sure. Rarely do they result in false negatives, meaning kids can't fake it. Usually. So they're pretty reliable and valid in terms of finding children who are at risk. The information that these provide is really how functional the core curriculum is. So we're looking for at least, and that is a minimum, at least 80% students showing adequate progress. If you have more than 80%, less than 80% of your students, fewer than 80% meeting those goals, that just means you have to allocate your precious resources for reading intervention, etc., to more students. So that's why we really want to get at least 80% meeting those benchmark goals. And they're identifying the students who might not be making progress so that they might need more information. Again, that's what the focus of this webinar is going to be. Our universal screeners are considered curriculum-based measures, and we use that term CBM a lot. These are time tests, so they're really telling us how automatic these skills are. These CBMs, we have them for math, so they're not just literacy, but of course we're talking about reading today. The data that these screeners elicit can actually be analyzed by teachers. So I highly encourage you to go beyond the numbers and look at the raw data, because you're going to see error patterns with these CBMs. And what we're also looking at too is analyzing the data to determine how much adjustment needs to be made in terms of instruction. And then also these data can be used to compare how students are doing classroom to classroom, grade level to grade level, and across a school and a district. Other information is that we can identify students who are at risk. To me, this is the big bonus for using the universal screeners. We find these students as early as possible. The strongest indicators, for example, for students who are at risk for SLD dyslexia are difficulties with phonemic awareness, letter sounds, learning to decode, etc. So those assessments include subtests, and we'll be talking more about that specifically look at those foundational skills. The last bullet is really important because it's not always possible to rule out if poor performance is due to SLD dyslexia or other reasons, including poverty and limited exposure to what I call academic language. That's the language of instruction. So that's something to really think about and keep in mind. Tests that identify the risk for SLD dyslexia, as I mentioned, to go a little bit deeper to that area of identification. According to Motes and Dakin, who wrote a great book about this, and this is also referenced in your resources at the end, we're looking at time tests of letter naming or letter-sound association in kindergarten and early first grade. These are great indicators of risk, as is phonemic awareness. Any phonemic awareness task, or not any, and we'll talk more about the types of tasks here, are also usually involved in identifying students at risk, because phonemic awareness is certainly an underlying problem for these students. Direct measures of decoding and word recognition toward the middle and end of first grade are also very important as we identify students at risk for SLD dyslexia. And lastly, an oral reading fluency measure that combines both rate and accuracy. This is also a very important test that would identify risk. So we just talked about these universal screeners, these CBMs that are designed and constructed for using classroom materials. We're looking at measuring, did the students learn what they were taught? But CBMs don't tell us everything we need to know, and that's why we will need to dig deeper and use diagnostic assessments to tell us why the student is struggling. And this is actually the basis for the next decision tree that you're going to be looking at. Again, this is a separate handout. I know you cannot read this very well on this slide, and I'm not expecting you to, but what you'll see here is you'll notice, if my pointer works, which I don't think it does, because, no, of course not. What do I think? I've got a new technology? Like, no. All right, just a little chuckle here. You can't see the pointer, but the way this decision tree works is at the top left, you see reading comprehension. This is if the student is struggling with reading comprehension, we need to dig deeper. If the student's reading comprehension is low, we're going to go dig deeper, and we're going to first look at the student's fluency. If that's at grade level, we can work on vocabulary and comprehension, because we know that's probably what I might call the culprit, the area that the student needs more specific support with. However, if the student's fluency is below benchmark, we're going to dig deeper and look at word recognition, okay? And you can just look down the line here, and we're going to talk more about this as the webinar proceeds. If the student comes out on grade level, you're going to go across and work on those different skills. You may notice, and I don't know if you have this in color or not. Does this print out in color?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so if it prints out in color, you're going to notice vocabulary comprehension is in red. And the reason for that is because vocabulary comprehension, by and large, needs to be a focus of instruction throughout for all students, right? And we're going to talk about this a little bit more as the webinar proceeds, but that's why you're going to see it in red. However, if the student has difficulties with word recognition, right, in the second box, you're going to dig deeper. But if they're on grade level, you're still going to need to work on, for this particular student, on spelling and fluency. As you go down and dig deeper and find more problems, you just notice that there's more in that box. There's more that you have to work on. At the end of the line, you are going to have to discuss referral to special education, right? Because the student has had difficulty on all these aspects of reading. I must also say, and this is very important, a referral can be made at any time along the way. If a team suspects the presence of SLD dyslexia, that you do not have to get to the bottom of this decision tree to make a referral. So let's talk more about this diagnostic decision tree. And what we're going to check is reading fluency first. And oral reading fluency is defined here: speed, accuracy, expression. And there are 4 things that students need to be able to do to be considered fluent. They have to read the words accurately, automatically, with proper phrasing, meaning in grammatical entities, and with intonation. Those are 4 important points to fluency. Actually, sorry, I'm going to go back just a second. And I want to say that if the student's language comprehension is intact, we're checking that fluency. And by fluency, I've just outlined those 4 aspects to it. It's reading text effortlessly. In order to read text effortlessly, we know that students have to have good word recognition. And word recognition and skilled word recognition is also involves 4 different things. First, it involves having phonological awareness. And phonological awareness can be categorized as basic or advanced. Again, this is a really important concept that I think I understood even more clearly after reading Kilpatrick's book. Basic phonemic awareness or phonological awareness includes segmenting and blending. Advanced phonological awareness includes phoneme manipulation, and that might be elision, so deleting a phoneme. It might be substituting a phoneme for another sound. It might be addition. So that advanced phonological or phonemic awareness is really a good insight into whether or not the student is struggling with phonological processing, and we'll talk more about that. Letter sound knowledge is also required for word recognition, and that has to be automatic. And then once the students are automatic with that letter sound awareness, they have to be able to blend accurately those sounds to be able to decode words. And then the last prerequisite for good word recognition is automaticity. And they have to read words as though every single one is a sight word. And we refer to this as orthographic mapping or phonological long-term memory. I apologize for the jargon and the terms, but those are really important concepts, and I'm going to come back to that idea of orthographic mapping on slide 39, but something that we really need to be thinking about. What this means is that every word is recognized instantly and effortlessly, and it is the recall of familiar words. So words have to become familiar for students. We want to now think about what what you might use in terms of your universal screening data to know that you have to dig deeper. And for many of the following slides, I use the DIBELS Next as an example, since it includes information about these important foundational skills. So bear with me. If you're not familiar with DIBELS Next, that's something that you might want to look at because it does outline these foundational skills. Similarly, Ames Web has most of the same subtests. So, for example, you've done your universal screening and you're looking at the DIBELS Next phonemic segmentation fluency, which is really measuring, going back to the slide before, this idea of basic phonemic awareness, in this case segmenting. If you need to dig deeper to understand more about why that student had trouble with that specific task, you could administer either formal or informal diagnostic assessments, and I've listed some here. So the PAT2, and again, these are all in your resource guide that I pointed to earlier, or the LAC, the Lindenwood Auditory Conceptualization Test. Or if you're not using those formal tests, because usually those tests are administered by reading interventionists or special ed teachers, you as a classroom teacher or you as a reading interventionist might be more inclined to pick up the core Assessing Reading Multiple Measures book, and you'll see I'm going to reference a lot of those assessments. That also is in your reference list at the end. That I've listed 3 informal measures here. The core phonological segmentation test. This measures basic PA. There's no manipulation task in that. The phonological awareness skills test is an excellent one as well, and that one is Robertson and Salter, and that one does have a manipulation test, or task I should say, and then the Yop-Singer. All right, so you're going to see, let me go back one second. You're going to see slides like this now throughout the rest of the presentation. So just to reorient you, you see the universal screening at the top, and now you're going to say, oh, I've got a situation where I need to dig deeper and administer some diagnostic assessments. So before I share some of those slides with you, I want you to meet Jessica so that we can have this data be more real, have this come alive. Jessica is a pseudonym for an actual student that we had the pleasure of getting to know. Jessica is a first grade student. She was identified as kindergarten as needing support. She didn't receive any support in kindergarten, but when she got to first grade this year, it was clear she needed help. So she began to receive some Tier 2 support in the fall, around October. And here's her recent universal screening that occurred in December. Her oral reading fluency was 10, so she's in the red zone on everything. Red zone on oral reading fluency, nonsense word fluency, which includes correct letter sounds. That's that letter sound automaticity, but then blending it. So you have those 2 aspects to decoding. And in addition, no surprise, Jessica's phonemic segmentation fluency was also very low. And in fact, PSF is not administered in the middle of first grade, but we knew, and her teacher knew, that she needed to do an off-grade level test, which you are absolutely encouraged to do in this case. We can also look at Jessica's running record. You see the actual text on the left, and you can see she really struggled with this text. It took her 2.5 minutes to read this, and we finally said, okay, or not we, her teacher said, okay, you can stop now, Jessica. She was sweating. She was clearly struggling with this. She had lots of word repetitions, hesitations, but she persevered. She was unbelievable in her perseverance in reading this. Let's look at a spelling sample. Jessica struggles with spelling, and you can see it's interesting, reversal in number 8. She wrote, the word was B, and she wrote D-E with a capital D. had trouble with the vowel in number 9. Number 10, that was, she wrote FISS for fix. And you can see number 11, she wrote CANCK for cake. I think she learned the CK rule, but she just didn't know the application. Another interesting writing sample, she was asked to write a sentence with the word until. So she did have that to look at, but you can see she really struggled with this, writing until it is time for the best party. So a little bit of Jessica, and we'll come back to Jessica as we move along. We also administered, not we, I'm saying we, her teacher administered the phonological segmentation test to dig deeper, to learn more about what she could do with phonological awareness. And she could do some of the sentences into words, and half of the stimuli, she was able to break up those words into syllables, but she really struggled breaking up the words into phonemes. So segmenting phonemes was very difficult. Before we go any further with Jessica, and also just some of this idea of digging deeper and looking for diagnostic information, I think it's important for me to very quickly talk about these 3 aspects of phonological processing. Since phonological processing is usually referred to as the core deficit in students with SLD dyslexia, it's important for us to understand that there are 3 aspects to this, and these are the 3: phonological awareness, and here are some assessments that would measure that; phonological memory, which is really holding information as we think about it, often referred to as working memory as well. Several assessments that you could use to learn more about the student's difficulties in that arena. And thirdly is the processing naming speed component, which is really looking at how quickly the student can access rote information. Rote meaning naming familiar things. When students have problems with all 3 of these, I call them triple whammy kids. Marianne Wolf talks about the double deficit, where you have problems with phonological awareness and naming speed difficulties. So you can imagine that those play an important role in the student's ability to learn and retain information. Some of our students or not some, but some of the phonological processing problems will impact fluency and automaticity. So if we think of phonological memory as involving attention and concentration, and phonological processing as really being how quickly you can retrieve things and name things, that is going to absolutely implicate your ability to read and do anything with automaticity, including producing the letters and numbers as you're writing, as you're naming and spelling and writing, knowing those patterns for automatic word recognition, and even being able to retrieve words from your lexicon. That word retrieval is going to be impacted. So all of this is to say that we will need to supplement the universal screening information for those students who are showing signs of phonological processing difficulties. And as I mentioned in that earlier slide, we will want to look at an advanced stage of phonological awareness, which is the manipulation that I referred to before. And here are a couple of assessments that include manipulation tasks. We also want to say here, and I think I've said it before, but these memory tasks not only tell us about the student's working memory and just their attention, etc., but it also tells us how likely they are to respond to these Tier 2 interventions, because that's something we really need to understand as well. So here I've called out specifically some terminology, the phonological short-term memory affiliated with word reading, and the working memory that's often affiliated with reading comprehension. There is a distinction between the two, although there is overlap between the two as well. And here are some assessments that tap that, that particular processing skill. So let's go back here and talk about what's required for word recognition. You saw this earlier, and here I'm specifically calling out this phonological blending, a very important aspect of word recognition, which for those of you who are viewing this webinar, you know you can teach those students those sound symbol and they're pretty automatic with them, but when they go to blend, all bets are off. You never know what you're going to hear them say, and when they blend, try to blend those sounds. So that's a very, very important aspect to identify students that need more instruction. And if we think about that and look at what skills are involved in that phonological blending piece, really we're talking about decoding, and we've already talked about this concept of mastering the letter sound, being able to blend, and then at the end of this, pronouncing those words and activating what the students know so that the words become sight words. That's really the big takeaway here, that every word becomes a sight word. So I'm not going to read this slide. I think most of you know what this is all about here. I point to a couple of assessments at the end here. If you're not using a DIBELS, that's no problem. You can use a core phonics survey that's going to give you some of the same information that you'll need to know about the student's letter sound knowledge. I do, however, want to take just a minute to define a sight word, and here's the definition that I like to use. The words that are recognized instantly. They can be phonetically regular or irregular, but it is a familiar word rather than an unfamiliar word. Because what happens when a word is unfamiliar is that either the student will sound it out or they'll guess. Okay, so that's, again, something to think about. And again, from Kilpatrick's book, I love the definition of the sight vocabulary as the pool of words they can instantly recognize. Another important concept that I alluded to earlier, and I said I was going to talk for a minute about this, is that concept of orthographic mapping. This is the process that readers use to store those words so that they can retrieve them and recognize those words automatically so that they can become fluent readers. This is the concept, the process that explains how readers build their sight vocabulary. So let's talk now, let's go back to our idea of digging deeper and how we might assess phonics skills. If you're using universal screeners that look at nonsense word fluency, you're going to get information about their letter sound knowledge as well as their ability to blend those sounds and read words. You also can use EasyCBM to tell you more about their knowledge of letter names and letter sounds. Want you to just note that the EasyCBM is not on the CSD's approved menu. However, it is something you can access online, and I think we have that information for you. So if you want to dig deeper based on the universal screening data, you have, again, choices of formal and informal tests. Formal, those listed here, that are time tests, and informal, the untimed tests, including a scholastic, nonsense word test, and a core phonics survey. So let's look at how Jessica did on her phonics diagnostics. She, again, we use the core to look at her letter sound knowledge, and she knows some but not all of her consonant sounds, and she's really struggling with her vowel sounds. And we also looked at her ability to apply that knowledge as she read CVC, closed syllable words, and you see here she really struggles with that. Again, no surprise based on the data we're looking at. And the core does have 10 real words and 5 nonsense words in each set. And I point you to that resource because it's definitely filled with lots of great information to do what we're suggesting you might want to do here. I'm going to share Jessica's data from her developmental spelling assessment. This is an assessment that I've used a lot with teachers, and it's given us great information. It's also been used to help form instructional groups based on where the students are, what they're using but confusing. So here you see the list of 25 words. We're looking at words that are all words with all closed syllable words with short vowels. You have a combination of words with initial single consonants and final consonants. You have digraphs. You have some words with blends, etc. I don't have time to go into the nitty-gritty of a developmental spelling assessment. You can use an inventory from Words Their Way, but it's great practice. It really will give you insight into the kinds of errors that students make, whether they be phonological or orthographic or morphological. Spelling is a great window into learning more about what the student knows about the language and how words work. But let's take a look at what Jessica did on this assessment. So she spelled 3 out of the 25 words correctly. So she's obviously struggling here. She did spell a couple of words. She got the feature correct on a couple of the words here. So you do give points if they don't spell the word correctly, but they got the word, they got a part of the word. So take, for example, number 24. She did not get the vowel sound correct, but she did have an R for the initial sound, so she gets 1 point there. But the point of this is really to say that Jessica's having difficulty both with decoding and with encoding. This is not a surprise, given the reciprocal nature of those two skills. Very important to be looking at both decoding and encoding. And before we talk more specifically about fluency as it relates to this idea of word recognition, etc., we want to think about 4 types of fluency tasks. So you have the RAN that I've mentioned before, the rapid naming tasks. You also can be looking at word level fluency, sentence level fluency, and passage level fluency. They're all important, but they're looking at different aspects of fluency. So looking now, going back to our whole idea of digging deeper, and now we're talking specifically about word identification, and we're looking at the students' oral reading fluency data, and we're seeing that we need to dig deeper. So again, we have choices to make. We can do formal, timed diagnostic assessments, and here we have quite a nice selection to choose from. Or if we can't do those formal timed assessments, we're not in a position to do those, we can still get very valuable information by administering an informal untimed test, such as the San Diego Quick Assessment, which you'll find in the core book, or a graded high-frequency word list. So here we're looking at students' ability to read the words without the context to help. And why would we want to do that? Actually, skilled readers can read words just as quickly in and out of context. And that's an important concept, because unskilled readers over-rely on context. Sometimes they do better in contextual word reading, but if you give them a word list without the context, you see them stumble, and that's another little red flag to look at. So for example, here's some diagnostic data on Jessica. When she was given the San Diego reading assessment, you're seeing the pre-primer list here. The words that she was reading were on the left. The word that she actually read, her response is on the right. So she did get a few of these right. Out of the list of 10 words, she was able to read 8 out of 10 correctly in the pre-primer list. On the primer list, she had much more difficulty, and she actually only read 3 words correctly here. And again, this just points to the fact that she is lacking that automaticity, and we need to dig deeper and find out more about what's going on for Jessica. Keeping in mind, Jessica's now in first grade. We'll come back to Jessica again, but let's look at reading fluency now. So we've looked at assessing the word identification, and now we're going to talk about the reading fluency. Again, you see the universal screening data, and if we want to dig deeper for how they're doing and on another assessment, giving us a little more data, we have some great choices here for formal time tests, and then we have some choices for informal, untimed tests, including, I know most of you are familiar with informal reading inventories. There are many to choose from out there, and they all have their different pros and cons of why you would select one over another. And then you have the core oral reading fluency measures that are included in the core assessing reading multiple measure books that I keep referring to. In this case, we're looking at sentence level and passage level fluency. So let's go back to Jessica and see how she did on one of these core passages. These are, this is a timed test because we have to see how many words correct per minute she was able to read. And this is the text that she was attempting to read on the left. It's a first grade passage, and you can see she really, really struggled. She started out trying to sound out the word part. She got to of and said from, for. She knew the word the, but she struggled, and she never got very far reading 4 words correct per minute on this first grade passage, which would put her at the 10th, well, let's put it this way, less than 10th percentile, because the 10th percentile benchmark goal for the winter is 6 words correct per minute. So now we're going to shift gears because we need to move along and we need to talk about reading comprehension. And obviously this is a very, very important piece of the puzzle, as going back to the simple view. We've spent the last 40 minutes or 45 minutes talking about decoding, word recognition, fluency, but the other side of the equation is that language comprehension piece, and we certainly have our fair share of students who struggle in that arena. So when we're assessing reading comprehension, here's something to think about. If the student has difficulty with reading, despite the fact that they have average or adequate word level skills and oral reading proficiency, we know that, we've measured it, then we really need to assess these other areas, including oral language, listening comprehension, vocabulary, okay? And you see asterisks after the oral language and listening comprehension because traditionally, characteristically, the speech and language pathologists would be the ones to administer those assessments. They're the experts. I hope there's some of you are on this call and participating in this webinar because you have such a wealth of information to share and are really important partners in solving these problems or getting to the heart of the problem, particularly when we're talking about comprehension. The last bullet is also important because comprehension assessments define the construct of reading comprehension in many ways. So there's sometimes the case that you might want to think about what that reading comprehension assessment task is and what construct, what is it measuring about reading comprehension? Because reading comprehension is so complicated, complex, multifaceted. I'm not going to try to go back to the slide because that will take too much time, but if you think about that simple view and refer back to that top of the strands of reading that Scarborough developed years ago, think about all those pieces of language comprehension that are involved in skilled comprehension. So if we need to dig deeper because we found a student that has difficulties with reading comprehension and we know their decoding and word recognition is intact, And we know based on their DIBELS data, or we know we have an easy CBM assessment that shows that they're struggling with reading comprehension, then we will have choices of formal or informal assessments for digging deeper. The formal are listed here, and many of you are familiar with these, but if you're not, again, go back to that assessment resource guide to link you to a website that will give you more information. And in this case, we're really specifically pointing to some informal assessments that you should also consider. One of my favorite is the Qualitative Reading Inventory. It's now in its 6th edition. So it's been around for a long time, and the nice thing is that it does get revised frequently so that it has passages that the students, aren't going to be reading over and over again. Another informal assessment is the DRA2. It's informal in that I know there are timed aspects to it, but this is really more of a diagnostic assessment than it would be considered, certainly not a screener. So the DRA2 will provide lots of important information for reading comprehension, students that have difficulty with reading comprehension. If we're talking about vocabulary, that's a whole nother beast. We know how important vocabulary is. It correlates so highly with comprehension. We all know that that's hugely important in addressing comprehension difficulties. The difficulty lies in that there are very few diagnostic assessments out there that we might be able to use to say, what is going on with the student, where the problems lie, and et cetera, et cetera. I'm referring here to a Reading Rockets article. I suggest that you take a look at it. Again, you can touch on that link if you're looking at a PDF of the webinar, and it will bring you to the archived article. And it does mention those top 2, vocabulary knowledge scale and the vocabulary recognition tests. And then the core assessment book has a vocabulary screener. It also has the Critchlow verbal language scale. So very important that we understand more about what's going on with the student's knowledge of vocabulary. So now it might be a good time to go back and look at our decision tree, where we looked at those 2 questions to consider when students have difficulty with reading comprehension. This is the bottom of that flow chart, where we've asked, would the student understand if you read it to him? And the answer is no. Okay, so the student obviously is having difficulties with language and or listening comprehension, but the answer to that question would depend. So at the top it says no, and there are no attention issues, so attention isn't the problem. The bottom it says no, but he does or she does have attention issues out of school, so attention is an issue. And and then you're going to ask that next question, that follow-up question. Does his oral reading seem effortless? And as we said before, it may or it may not be effortless, depending. So here you get, some possible explanations. It could be hyperlexia, it could be a mixed reading difficulty. So again, we don't have a lot of time to go into the detail on this. I will just say quickly, hyperlexia is just the ability, it's like the opposite of dyslexia. Dyslexia can't decode very well. Hyperlexics can decode pretty much anything. They just have trouble with the comprehension of the words. So I am actually ahead of time, which is like unheard of. But I talked really fast, but that's good because we have more time for Q&A here, and we also I can spend some more time really digging into the interventions and how do we instruct these students. But this is a great breaking point for us. Before we break for Q&A, I love this golden rule of assessment because I'll read it. I haven't read too many slides, so I'll read this one. The best designed assessment with the most reliable and valid measures administered by the best trained assessor won't change a child's reading trajectory unless some of you, all of you, do something in the child's life that's different to make a difference. So with that being said, let's take some Q&A.
All right, thank you, Margie. We have some questions from the field, and the first question has to do with, you differentiated formal versus informal diagnostic assessments in the slides. And one of our participants is asking, who typically would administer which type or types of assessments? And then another question came through very specifically about which standardized tests can reading specialists administer?
Okay. That's a very important question, and I do believe that I addressed it, but I did it very quickly. I guess what I was saying is, if you notice how the slides are formatted, you have diagnostic assessments that would be considered formal, and many of those are timed tests, and then the informal are untimed. Generally speaking, the formal tests are administered by special ed teachers or reading interventionists. The important thing to know is that you have to know how to administer those assessments. They are standardized, meaning you have to administer them exactly the way they're meant to be administered. You cannot ad lib. You have to follow the protocol and do that with fidelity. So it just means you have to be trained. Most of those assessments, you don't have to have special training, but you just have to read the manual and take administration of those assessments seriously. And that means that you have to practice. Before you actually administer them to a real student, you want to take the time to feel confident that you know what you're doing. Okay, and the more you administer them, the more confident, the better you're going to get at that. The informal really can be administered by a classroom teacher, by a reading interventionist, by a special ed teacher. They're not standardized per se, that's why they're called informal. They're usually not standardized. And so you're really trying to get some diagnostic information about the student, and you're trying to elicit as valid information as possible. So those are not as, they're not as rigorous as far as the demand for fidelity, et cetera. And then you asked which standardized tests can reading specialists administer. I think they can administer any of them other than a psychological assessment, a WISC. Those types of assessments have to be administered by someone who's trained to administer those, but I don't think those are on the list anyway.
And so your point is that you have to have a proper training and
Yes.
have proper supervision in order to administer any assessments, and then interpret the data from the individual assessment and then look at the student more comprehensively to see their own unique pattern of strengths and weaknesses across assessments.
That's right. That's exactly right, Donna.
Okay. Another question that's come through is, what is a compensator?
That's a great question, and I'm glad you asked, because it's obviously on that Kilpatrick handout. And we talk about compensators a lot because there are many of our students are compensators. Usually those are the students, if you look at the top of that flow chart in the first box, that student is strong with listening comprehension, and that student was effortless when he read his oral reading fluency passage. But he's still having difficulty with reading comprehension. So why is that? It says he's a compensator, meaning he's using his language comprehension strengths, and that is compensating for some, he's able to compensate for the fact that he might have something else going on. So he could have attention problems, he could have working memory problems, he could just be an anxious student who doesn't like being assessed. And once you put the timer on, or he knows he's being evaluated, then he's not giving you his best work. So we call that student a compensator. You see that again in the third box down, where again you have a student who has relatively strong language comprehension, and oral reading fluency is pretty strong, but there could be some other, in this case, possible subtle issues, including issues with language. So they know how to compensate, but there may be something else we need to dig deeper and learn more about on that student.
Thank you, Margie. The next question that's come through is about Marie Clay's observation survey, and is that acceptable as a universal screen for letter sound recognition? So send that to either you or to Joanne. You figure out who would like to respond to that.
Yeah, I'll take that question. So one thing we have to think about is the state board approved list of universal screenings for the state of Connecticut. And as many of you or all of you well know, Marie Clay's observation survey is not listed on that short list. However, as Margie talked about earlier, certainly, this is a good assessment to use if you need this additional information. So keep that in mind. We do have an open review period for additional assessments that is upcoming. All superintendents will receive that information. So it's not to say that we can't ever include an additional assessment on that list. It's just that there is a process for presenting the information to the State Board of Education, and so we have to go through that process and then add an assessment to the approved list. So Margie, would you like to say anything else about
No,
this
that's
assessment
great.
specifically?
Nope.
Okay,
Thanks, Joanne.
sure.
All right, so a couple questions, some more questions came in, so thank you all for giving me an opportunity to respond. A question came in about, were measures of oral language, vocabulary, and listening comprehension administered to Jessica? And yes, they were. Jessica's very, very strong in listening comprehension. Vocabulary, she's got a great vocabulary, great oral language strengths. Sometimes has difficulty pulling out words, so word retrieval was a little bit of a problem for Jessica, and she gets flustered and frustrated because she is quite bright. And speaking of which, another question that came in was, how does IQ factor in to this process? And it's a great question. We have students that have, we always talk about students with SLD and dyslexic as average or above average in IQ, but there's standard deviations, right, to think about. So dyslexia exists on a continuum. SLD, dyslexia, just as an example, exists on a continuum, just like anything. So you can have students who have low average IQ and be dyslexic, students with average IQ and be dyslexic, students with above average IQ and be dyslexic. If a student is referred for special education, they will receive an IQ test, and that will give you that, give you more information about that IQ piece. But it's certainly a consideration. Another question that came in is talking a little bit more about the off-level testing, because as you recall, Jessica did not do well in her phonemic segmentation, that digging deeper with the core. Clearly she's struggling with phonological processing, and we need to get to the bottom of that. And one of the first things we said, the teacher said, well, I can give her an off-grade level test. Great idea. The PSF, the phonological segmentation, phonemic segmentation fluency, is administered in kindergarten in the beginning and the end of the year, at the beginning of first grade, and then it's discontinued. However, if a student continues to struggle with those skills, you can administer that assessment. That's just an example, right, where I want to know how she's doing, and I can graph her scores using that PSF, and I can do that, even up until second grade if I'm still working on that and I need a progress monitoring assessment to see. And we're going to look more and talk more about progress monitoring after this Q&A as we go along. But certainly it's very important to use the resources that you have and use those to track progress, and off-grade level testing makes sense in some cases. Somebody asked about informal assessments that are available for rapid naming, and very astutely, somebody pointed out that they were all part of the formal suggestions. I don't know of any informal rapid naming tests, and Donna's shaking her head too. So I don't know of any. To be truthful though, a letter naming task is kind of a rapid naming task, right? However, that would be if your students knew those letters, and usually we're administering that assessment in kindergarten because they don't automatically know and retrieve those letters. But to be honest, the DIBELS is really looking at automaticity, and as such, it is looking at rapid naming and students' ability to be doing things, effortlessly. So I'm not sure I answered that, but no, there isn't any informal assessment that I'm aware of in that regard.
We did have some questions about screening tools that Joanne is going to kick off a response to.
Great.
Sure. The first question is about the iReady assessment as a universal screener. That assessment was recently approved by the state board, so it is included in our list of approved universal screeners. It's listed in section 2 under, I'm sorry, okay, it's listed in section 2 of the, on the list. And so the point though is that assessment did meet all of the required technical adequacy elements around validity and reliability, and so that is included. And then the other question was about professional learning. I presume that's what this question is about. Professional learning provided by the state around the assessment as it relates to struggling readers. So basically looking at profiles of struggling readers and providing feedback and next steps about instruction is what I presume the question means here. And at the state level, we aren't necessarily preparing to provide that type of professional learning opportunity. Doesn't mean we won't ever in the future, but at this point, we really are pointing people to those assessment companies. We know that MClass, which is primarily DIBELS Next, does provide professional learning in that area where you're looking at student profiles and then determining next steps instructionally. Ames Web, I believe, does that also. I know that DIBELS Next, which is available at no cost at the University of Oregon website, there are webinars posted at no charge, so take a look there. I just received another question, STAR and its appropriateness for K-2 universal screening. Are there better options? I think that for STAR, if that's what your district has adopted and has decided to administer to all K-2 students, it might be worth. Then once you take a look at the outcomes for students in those grades, it might be worth in using another protocol. For example, DIBELS Next, which is available at no cost from the University of Oregon website. That's one option. But in terms of the appropriateness of computer adaptive assessments for grades K-2 really is the broader question or concern by many districts. I think that, again, it's working with the company, the assessment companies, and taking a look at the actual what's actually being presented to students in those computer adaptive measures, and then understanding the appropriateness of how students respond. There are some districts that are saying that grades K-2, those students are just really too young. Other districts have said those students have done well using the computer adaptive measures. So it's really just carefully taking a look and doing an assessment at the district level in terms of how the outcomes represent students' abilities and understandings.
Thank you, Joanne. A question for Margie is, what if a student is on or above grade level in reading but has experienced difficulty with encoding? If you could comment on that.
Sure, I'd actually love to comment on that because as I mentioned before, spelling is such a great window into what's happening, what's going on with the student, and how much they understand about what I call English's orthography. Orthography referring to a language's writing system. English happens to have a very deep and complicated orthography. Having said that, If a student is struggling with spelling, it could be that they just haven't received good spelling instruction. And by good, I mean spelling instruction that really matches what they're learning in terms of the patterns of reading English and English words. And so if they haven't received that and they get it and they start to spell better, then it's pretty good idea that they don't have an underlying problem. If, however, they're not spelling and it's consistently poor and they've received good instruction, then it's a red flag that they probably we need to know more. Are they struggling because of phonological processing difficulties, or are they struggling because of this orthographic mapping principle, that they're just not internalizing those patterns and they're not making, they're not getting those principles deep enough. So it's really important. And we can analyze those spelling errors in very specific ways that will give us a lot of that information that doesn't necessarily necessitate doing a lot of extra assessment. We can just look at their writing sample.
Okay. There was a question that came through about what oral language and listening comprehension assessments do you recommend? And I think that this is part of the whole diagnostic process for students, whether it's within general ed or special ed, to be able to figure out, through starting with informal assessments, starting with observations and a language sample, what do teachers and families see as the child's areas of oral language strengths and weaknesses. So there's no particular battery, there's no particular protocol for any of these areas of assessment. It's really the process of diagnostic assessment is hypothesis testing.
Exactly.
It's figuring out what assessment tools you have that are valid and reliable, and that you have professionals in your building who can administer them and work in collaboration with other members of the PPT to figure out the entire diagnostic profile of the student. With that said, the assessment guide that's on the SDE's and SERC's website will give you lots of information about some options.
Right.
Amy?
I guess the one thing that I want to make sure people are clear about is, if the student has trouble with reading comprehension, and going back to those two different decision trees, but looking specifically at the Kilpatrick one, you're going to read something to him, right? If you read it to him, and people have asked me, well, what do I read to him? Anything. You can do the QRI. You can have him do one passage, he reads it, another passage, you read it to him. In the first case, you're measuring reading comprehension, including all the things that go into that, and obviously being able to decode words. But in the second case, you're reading it to him. You can ask the same questions that are in the QRI or any informal inventory, or make up a set of questions and read something that he's interested in hearing. You're going to get a picture of whether or not his listening comprehension is intact or not, right? And if it isn't, that's when you need to go to your SLP and talk to the SLP in your building and say, I have this student, his listening comprehension is a problem, and I need to understand what's going on, and can you point me in a direction? So work collaboratively. I know a lot of you are in the room with teams. That's awesome. This is not a problem that this is not work that should be done in silos alone. You really want to pool your resources and work together to find out what kids need.
Thank you, Margie. We did have one specific content question. You introduced the word hyperlexia.
Yes.
And if you could give a little bit more information, that question's come up a couple of times.
Yes, I'm happy to. Actually, I happen to have Kilpatrick's book, and the term is in the glossary, so I'm going to read to you what he says. A condition in which a student is proficient in word-level reading, but displays poor reading comprehension due to weak language skills. Hyperlexics have been referred to as word callers. I've thought of some students I've worked with in the past. These students were on the spectrum. So many of our students on the spectrum who can decode anything you put in front of them, can read words like crazy, but then you ask them to tell you what they read. They struggle with that. Their area is in, their weak area is in language and comprehension.
Great, thank you. We had one question about our English learners, and the question was very specific about what types of specific assessments are more or less valid for them. That is a very big topic, and we are in the process of preparing a training that will be an overview of our English learners. There's no easy answer to that. There's no quick answer to that. You really need to understand the students' L1 and L2, and you also need to understand the students' language, what aspects of that student's language, phonologically speaking, syntactically speaking, are the same or different as English. So that takes a knowledge base in order to be able to then even think about what types of assessment to give. Anything else to add to that, ladies?
No, I think you put it perfectly. And I would say if you want to see some resources, if you go to the Literacy How website, we have a section on dual language learners. I know everybody uses different terminology. My colleague Laura Reynolds from Southern Connecticut is a dual language expert, and she said that's the more current research term. It's basically ELL, so I don't like to get tripped up on terminology, but you'll find some good information there and point you to some resources. I think it's a huge, very, very important question that we're going to continue to have to grapple with to get answers and help for all of those of you in the field that have a plethora of English learners, dual language learners in your classroom.
Mm-hmm. I do want to reiterate that you need to have access to someone who has knowledge about second language acquisition. Right?
Yes.
Because otherwise, some of the symptoms or signs associated with reading difficulties can be masked or misread, misunderstood. So I just want to again throw out that word of caution.
That's great, thank you. Laura is assisting us in our
excellent.
I don't think you knew that. She's
I
assisting
didn't.
us in our preparation.
She's wonderful.
Alrighty, and we've got a couple of more minutes left before we go back to the presentation. I'm going to turn it over to Joanne, who's going to talk a little bit more broadly about the K-3 screeners.
Yes, I just wanted to give a final word there. So if you go to the State Department website, as you will know, on the ELA page, you'll find information about the screeners, right? So you'll find a list of screening instruments, you'll find an explanation of the subtests and which ones we believe should be used for the purposes of a universal screening assessment. Also, you will find what priority districts need to report in terms of those measures. I bring that up because that's a separate chart of information. My point there is that you'll see that for kindergarten, it's not until mid-year that we want data reported. So in other words, with kindergarten children, they learn so much so fast. Their abilities, as they grow and mature, they change within a short period of time. You want to think about what's appropriate developmentally, and for that reason, we're not asking for information until mid-year. Does it mean that you shouldn't use any of these other assessments prior to mid-year? That's not what I'm saying. But my point is that if you're assessing students, in the spring before they begin kindergarten, or beginning of the year, just know that there are going to be changes as children progress through this school year. So my point is just take that into consideration before we're making hard and fast rules about when to begin screening, when to not, to hold off. When we might think that because we've screened children previously, we don't need to until they get to first grade per se. That's an exaggeration, but you understand my point. Is that you need to be ever diligent about processing this information that you obtain from the screenings, and then making a decision, which screenings you might use mid-year K that are efficient, that will provide the information you need to make instructional decisions moving forward. Also, again, I'd like to reiterate that our review period will be opening up again. Superintendents will receive that information. So any assessment that is not listed there can be moved forward for consideration. There was a specific question about Ames Web Plus. That is, as the publishers have explained, different from Ames Web. And for Ames Web Plus, that company was in the midst of their norming studies and doing some other research, so it was not appropriate for that to be moved forward for consideration. So just keep in mind, that the open review period will open shortly, and you'll receive guidance on information that you need to provide in order to submit proposals to the State Department.
Thank you, Joanne. We're going to get back to our presentation. We do have some additional questions regarding assessments, and we'll compile those. And we will be stopping at about 11:15, and we'll see how many more of these questions we can address. So we'll
Sounds
turn
great.
it back over to Margie.
Thank you, Donna. Thank you, Joanne, for weighing in on some of these questions. So, as this slide suggests, we need to think about, obviously the assessments are important to get us the right information, but we have to use that information to guide instruction. So this slide sort of points to that. We're going to link the assessment data from a variety of measures listed on the left-hand side. All of these I've alluded to today. And we're going to link the assessment data to the component that it's associated with, and then to an intervention. So if you look at the middle box, we have the big five ideas from the National Reading Panel in 2000, and then we have an assessment that's linked to one of those five big ideas, and then to the right we have an example of either a strategy or a program. In the case of Wilson, Read Naturally, that would be a program that would address that idea, that big idea. And speaking of big ideas, as some of you have seen our reading wheel, but for those of you who haven't, we put those five big ideas in a circle around oral language. So you see phonemic awareness, you see phonics, vocabulary, and comprehension. You don't see fluency. We've talked a lot about fluency today, so I'm certainly have nothing against fluency, but I look at fluency in a slightly different way than I do phonemic awareness and phonics, etc. And I look at it as automaticity. And I think you probably understand better why, as you've heard me talk about assessing these different aspects of reading. You'll also notice there are a few things added. I talked about the importance of spelling, so you see that with phonics. I haven't talked a lot about morphology, but morphology, the study of the meaningful units of language, that's certainly a very important piece of the reading puzzle. So we have it in vocabulary, but you could also say it could belong in advanced phonics. And then we added writing with text comprehension. It's reciprocal skill. We're not going to talk about writing today, unfortunately. It's an important topic, but because we have limited time, I won't talk a lot about it, but it is reciprocal with text comprehension. And then you see syntax at the bottom of the page. And we're not going to talk about syntax per se today, but it's really the sentence level comprehension skills that often get in the way of reading comprehension that we're calling out specifically here. And then oral language was never mentioned as a big idea by the National Reading Panel, but it certainly is the foundation for all reading and writing. So moving along, I wanted to share this slide with you because we use it a lot in the work that we're doing with the state and the Connecticut K-3 Literacy Initiative that has been going on throughout the state in the Alliance School Districts for the last 4 years. And my colleague and partner in crime, Darcy Burns, who's the executive director of the Hill for Literacy, we use this continuum of foundational skills, what often is referred to as the staircase, for supporting the identification of an instructional focus area for students. And so starting with letter ID and just going up the staircase, these are the foundational skills that students need to master to become proficient readers. You'll notice that critical thinking skills, oral language, vocabulary pervade all of it, right? So we are always working on those critical thinking, oral language, vocabulary skills throughout the continuum, no matter what the students' foundational skills and other skills might look like. That's important to note here. And just, again, going back to a couple things that I just mentioned, that any student who struggles with reading, we need to acknowledge that there's this foundation of oral language, and that has many implications. I don't have time to discuss all of them today, but I guess the main thing I want to say is these students, whether they're students with SLD dyslexia or students with comprehension difficulties, they all benefit from having an opportunity to orally express language. The students with those 3 different profiles, however, are going to need a different instructional focus depending on what you've learned from the administration of some of those diagnostic assessments. And while some students with reading difficulties have those comprehension strengths that we talked about, Jessica being one of them, they don't like to read. So what does that mean? They're not going to be developing some vocabulary skills and reading comprehension strategy or strategic application as they read. Those things are going to suffer. So what does that mean? All components have to be addressed in many cases. So what would we say would be a good way to address those? Well, a couple years ago, the International Dyslexia Association looked for consensus among its members and people who were very actively engaged in the organization that's now, 70 years old. And they came up with a common name for the type of instruction that we believe is beneficial for students that have any kind of reading difficulty / disability, and call it structured literacy. Again, if you point your cursor to structured literacy, you can download a PDF of a more elaborate description of that. But I'm just going to highlight some of those things. We're talking here about 2 components. One are the elements of language that are taught to address the language basis of LD / RD / SLD / dyslexia, right? The common denominator is language. So we want our teachers to understand there's a structure to any language, but in this case we're talking about English, that needs to be understood first by the teacher, really well understood, in order to be able to teach their students. And I'll describe what I mean by that in a minute, and what those elements are. And then the second component that's as important as the elements are is the principles of instruction that guide how those elements would be taught. We won't be spending a lot of time today talking about those principles per se, because those are principles of good instruction that include teaching explicitly and diagnostically, etc. We just don't have time today to go into the details of that. But if you're interested in learning more, as I said, there's great resources to point you to. So what are the elements of a structured language program or approach? And before I go through the list, I just want to explain that you can have a structured literacy program, a program being like a Wilson reading system, or language ! Language Live, foundations. There's lots of programs out there that are meant to be followed with fidelity, okay? Or you can use a structured literacy approach. And as many of you know, I'm pretty agnostic when it comes to programs. I think it's most important that we select a program that fits the profile of the student. When I say I'm agnostic, it means that I'm really very interested in the expertise of the teacher, and the expertise of the teacher in knowing this these 6 aspects to structured literacy. But if you are using a program, and there are wonderful programs out there, then you need to know that program, right? So you need to know the elements, and you need to know the program and know how to deliver that with fidelity. And I hope that's clear, but if you have questions, maybe I can get to that at the end of the webinar. So the elements are defined in that PDF that I referred to, but phonology, referring to the sound system of English, sound symbol association, we talked a lot about letter sound correspondence and how important that is. Syllable instructions, so teaching the vowel patterns of English, morphology, teaching the meaning units, syntax, teaching the structure, that sentence structure, and what the building blocks of those sentences are, the phrasal structure, the clausal structure, etc. And then semantics, talking about more the meaning base of English. So all of these are very important, and you're going to weight them differently depending on the profile of your students. Some will need 1 or 2, while others might need an emphasis on all 6. So, and we'll talk more about that as we go along. Before we do that, however, let's go back to Jessica. And let's go back to Jessica's phonological awareness data, because we're going to talk about each of these elements in some depth. And here's Jessica's phonological awareness skills test data from October, before her targeted intervention began. And you can see she's having trouble with phonological awareness that's more the large grain size, the rhymes, the syllables. But so if she's having trouble at that level, we know she's probably going to really struggle at the phoneme level. And there is a hierarchy for teaching phonological awareness. We put that hierarchy into a rocket ship that you can find on our website. But you can see where the breakdown occurs. Rhyming, if you look at this just for a moment, notice that she struggles with rhyme. She's doing okay with syllable blending, segmentation not as well, syllable deletion not well at all. So the manipulation task, the advanced phoneme awareness, is a problem. But she's also struggling with rhyming. That's not uncommon for a student with SLD dyslexia, which, as by now you probably recognize that is her profile. So we don't get hung up on rhyme. We just see it as a red flag, but we don't get hung up on it, because some of our students with dyslexia are never good at rhyming, but they learn to read and they learn to decode. So let's talk about what we would do for someone like Jessica who is struggling, and what would a Tier 2 intervention include if we have a student with Jessica's profile who's clearly struggling with phonemic awareness. First of all, we want to notice here that this is where multisensory is really, I think, an important component. By that I mean we want the student to be aware of how those sounds are articulated. The mirrors help with that for the visual, feeling their throat, noticing what their lip, their tongue, their mouth is doing, that kinesthetic component. Those are very important aspects to teaching phonemic awareness and working with students on that skill. It's also important because phonemic awareness is so abstract. Those phonemes we don't speak in phonemes. We don't say, I had a nice at the party, right? Those phonemes are co-articulated, which is why phonological processing is problematic for some. So say it and move it, where you have discs for concrete representation, or doing it, we call say it and move it on your body. Those are great little tools and tips, Elkonin boxes. And then sound sorting. I can't say enough about the importance of having the students sort pictures or objects by initial, final, or medial sound. So you make sure they can isolate those sounds and they can categorize those sounds. And we're going to talk about progress monitoring all of this. And before I do that, I just love this little cartoon that talks about the importance of progress monitoring. So a lot of teachers will say, I taught him, I taught her. In this case, I taught Stripe how to whistle, and this other little boy says, but I don't hear him whistling. And then the child responds, I said I taught him, I didn't say he learned it, right? So we have to progress monitor because we might be teaching ourselves, you know, I mean, we all do. We know we taught it, we have great intentions, we turn ourselves inside out teaching, but we have to know if the student actually learned what we taught. So going back to the whole concept of a curriculum-based measure, the genius and the beauty of CBMs are they really do help us make those instructional decisions, including the monitoring of a student growth within the group, including creating groups based on the data, including identifying the skill deficits, and screening, et cetera. And then even using these assessments to aid in eligibility decisions. So there's really important components to CBMs that help us do our work. We also might supplement those CBMs with what are called criterion reference tests. So this really is looking at mastery of a series of short-term objectives, and in order to use a CRT, really have to have a scope and sequence that outlines what those objectives and criteria are, and then it also will define the procedures aligned with those checkpoints in that sequence. So we're looking at the CRTs as mastery tests. So we're looking at a predetermined level of competency. We're also asking and answering the question, what skills or concepts have the students mastered? And these items, as I said, are based on standards and or objectives that students should answer correctly and provide diagnostic information. And you know, this is where you say the student will achieve this at 80% or 90%. So you set the goal and the criteria for success, you the teacher, or you the PPT team. But along the way, something that I know teachers struggle with a lot is how do they monitor progress and what level do they monitor? And so this is an important concept to think about. Since we talked earlier that accuracy develops before automaticity, and in fact is more important than fluency. So one of the reasons we took fluency out of the reading wheel is because we saw teachers working on improving their students' words correct per minute. And their message was read faster, read faster, read faster. We're trying to get you to read more words, you know, correctly per minute. Well, that's not the point. The point is to read with meaning. And if a student has slow processing speed, they're going to read more slowly, and you're not going to expect them to read at a 75th or 90th percentile. So, sorry I went off the reservation a little bit on that, but I think an important point. So if we know accuracy is important, we have to look at if the student has accuracy greater than 95%, we'll monitor that student at grade level. If they're not accurate at that level, then we will want to monitor the accuracy, and this is where decoding accuracy is referred to here in addition to fluency. And we know that the student can be monitored at both grade level and instructional level. In the case of monitoring progress to see if the instruction is working, we want to be looking at monitoring that instructional level more frequently. So what assessments would we use to monitor? Now we're talking about monitoring phonological phonemic awareness, right? And before we're talking about diagnostic assessments, here we're talking about what would you use for progress monitoring. If you're looking for a CBM, you can use that Dibbles PSF, and you can even do it as an off-grade level, or you can use Easy CBM, another great resource for some of these assessments, and their assessment is phoneme segmentation, or phoneme segmenting, basically the same skill. Or you can choose and or you can do a criterion reference test, and I've talked about all of these. Let's look at Jessica's progress monitoring data. So I mentioned that in October, just a few months ago, she was selected to have intervention in a Tier 2. because of her data that is listed here. And after 2 short months and very targeted, intensive instruction, she actually is making great progress. We didn't worry about the rhyming, but we started at the syllable blending and segmenting and level, still having trouble with advanced phonemic awareness a la syllable deletion, but she did make a little bit of progress there. But we're really targeting her isolation, her phoneme isolation, and blending and segmenting. So she's making good progress. So we know what we've done with her has worked so far. Jessica is also, and students like her, also going to need interventions specific to those phonics skills, the decoding and encoding. And here I'm just pointing to some good evidence-based practices. These practices, by the way, could be used in classroom instruction, Tier 2, Tier 3, special ed. If you're working on phonics, these are just good, solid things to do. First, explicitly instructing letter-sound correspondences, and not drill and kill. If there's 7 sounds that they don't know, then just work on those 7 and progress monitor those 7. Decoding and encoding must be taught reciprocally, right? So if you're teaching a pattern as a decoding pattern, you give them practice spelling that pattern. Sound letter mapping, word chains, great method for helping develop those phonics decoding and encoding skills. Sorting words, and these word sorts, I see a lot of word sorting all over the state. They're not everyone is using them properly or well. So the one thing I will say, if you get kids sorting words, that's great. It should be targeted to whatever it is that they're working on specifically, not just a busy activity. They should always read the words after they've sorted. It sounds pretty common, or pretty common sense, logical, but it's often not happening. High frequency word charts are also a great thing to support their fluent reading and instant word recognition, teaching the syllable types, teaching them to blend syllables once they've learned those syllable types in multisyllabic words, particularly once we get to 2nd grade. Students should be applying a lot of this in multisyllabic word reading. And then lastly, I mentioned the morphology, giving those students explicit instruction in the meaning of those roots and affixes so they understand the relationship between the spelling and the meaning, otherwise referred to as advanced phonics by some. So if we're looking at monitoring our progress because we've selected an intervention that actually addresses the needs of the student for decoding and encoding, we can use the DIBBLES, nonsense word fluency, and there's lots of 20 forms on the DIBBLES. They're equivalent forms, so you can use those every few weeks if you need to, however frequently you need to. Or you can use, you can use the criterion reference test listed here. And some new ones that you haven't heard about today, the WADE, which is a Wilson assessment, but you can use that even if you're not using a Wilson, the reading system for intervention. It's a great assessment. Gallistel Ellis, been around for many, many years. Betty Gallistel taught at Southern Connecticut. Some of you may remember her if you're as old as I am. Spelling inventories that are included in Words Their Way, and the developmental spelling assessment. So those are all good choices. Going back to our friend Jessica, we're teaching phonics skills, so we need to make sure we're looking at her decoding, and we're using the core as we used back in October to see that she was struggling with the closed syllable words. But 2 months later, I'm happy to report, with good instruction, she's reading those CPC words, and now we're working with her on the blends. So what would we want to recommend for students who have difficulties with reading fluency? They will probably need some or all of what we just talked about, but maybe they've gotten to a level where their phonemic awareness has improved, their decoding and encoding is getting better. And now, their accuracy, I should say, is improved, but they're not automatic. So there's some really great tools, evidence-based practices that are often included in programs that you're familiar with. One of these is a rapid word recognition chart, and those are charts that you, the teacher, make based on your data, based on the words that the students need some practice reading and just seeing over and over again. So that's one, reading words out of context. Another is phrase cued reading, and this is getting a little more bang for your buck in terms of not only working on the fluency and the automaticity of reading words, but you also can be working on syntax. That is, teaching students about those grammatical entities, whether it's a phrase, an elaborated noun phrase, like the very cute orange-colored calico cat, or a grammatical phrase like a noun phrase, or a subject or a predicate, or an independent clause or a dependent clause if the sentence is constructed differently. The point is that you're teaching the student to read with proper phrasing and intonation, and you're also teaching them about how sentences work and what the meaningful parts of a sentence are. All right, just going to take a quick, let me get through this slide and then I'll go back for a moment, because there was a question that came up here. Repeated readings, peer reading, student adult reading, again, these are just to help the student practice. And our students don't like to read by and large because it's hard. So any way we can get them to do it in a way that's engaging and motivating and fun and just something that they enjoy doing, that's the name of the game. Doing timed reading of word lists, sentences, and passages where they're competing against themselves, not other students, because we do want them to have goals and shoot for those goals. And then last on this list, wide reading, if there's a topic that they just really got interested in, weather, and you can find texts that have some of the same words, some of the same vocabulary words, maybe even structures, in terms of the text structure, and they got those patterns down. You get them reading a lot of different texts. Quick reads comes to mind. Elfriede Hebert's program, getting them to read on a topic but different passages. Okay, so I'm going to go back just a sec because Donna just brought to my attention some confusion about this particular slide on what level should be monitored. What was the question, Donna? Sorry.
So the question is, what levels should be monitored? Did you mean that if a student is reading above 95%?
Then you would monitor their grade level because their accuracy is good, right? If their accuracy is poor, in other words, if they're making a lot of errors as they're reading, then you would want to monitor accuracy in addition to fluency, which would mean that you might need to go below the grade level text.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Great. I hope that makes sense for the person who asked this question. And so let's go back to where we were before. Thank you.
You bet. All right, so let me make sure I'm on the right spot. Yes, I am. So what assessments would we use to monitor progress? We've mentioned all of these CBM assessments. Other assessments that you could use for monitoring progress we've also mentioned here. The point is that we do want to monitor the students' oral reading fluency, and there's choices, which is always good. So let's talk about vocabulary now. As I mentioned earlier, vocabulary is a different animal. when it comes to assessment, and this includes progress monitoring. But before we get there, let's talk about intervention for vocabulary, because many of our students need a lot of targeted instruction on vocabulary and word meanings. So explicit lessons introducing word meanings and giving them not a dictionary definition, but a student-friendly explanation, making them more conscious of words and knowing that there are degrees of knowing words, giving them practice with word categorization so they understand words are learned in networks, and that just expands their knowledge, their depth and breadth of knowledge. Multiple meaning words should be a very, very important part of vocabulary instruction, because a vast number, I don't know what the exact percentage is, but I think maybe it's 60% of the words in English are multiple meaning words, which means they can be used in different ways, in different contexts, as different parts of speech, etc. Figurative language and idioms are also a good target for instruction, especially for students who might be dual language learners, and even our students with SLD dyslexia. They really get tripped up with our figurative language, which is plentiful in English. And we have the word structure that we've alluded to before, that morphological structure that is a big part of most of our multisyllabic words. We want to teach that explicitly when we're working on vocabulary, and teaching students to categorize by morpheme, by prefix, suffix, or root. And I mentioned word networks is also a great way to intervene and do explicit instruction in vocabulary. And you'll notice here I'm talking about assessments monitoring progress in reading comprehension, not so much vocabulary, because again, that's a more challenging thing to monitor progress in. I don't believe that I have a slide per se stating what to do for monitoring vocabulary. What we did quite a while ago, when we were using a program to teach vocabulary in a research study that we conducted while I was at Haskins, we actually monitored the students' progress on the words that they learned in this particular program based on Beck's work. And we did have pre and post test assessments on those vocabulary words, because we wanted to see if the students were actually learning the words we were teaching them. So that's always an option. But what about monitoring progress in reading comprehension? Again, we have these CBMs that I've talked about today, and as I said, here are your other assessments that could be used to supplement. And what are some interventions that we can point to for reading comprehension? All students benefit from some or all of these interventions, but particularly students whose area of need is really the language comprehension area, and applying the strategies as they read. So explicit lessons teaching how those words, the phrases, and clauses function in a sentence. This is that syntax instruction that I was talking about earlier. Also, in terms of teaching them how sentences work, teaching them and showing them how to combine clauses with various conjunctions to create either compound or complex sentences. So many of the sentences that they read in complex text have unusual sentence structure and clausal structure. So helping them to deconstruct some of those sentences by clause, by phrase, to help them understand how to do that, and what those structures mean is very important. And then another great intervention methodology is teaching using graphic and semantic organizers. Again, teaching them how the words are relating to one another in those sentences. Another is to teach text structure. And we know narrative structure is one text structure, and that's often why we start with that one, because all narratives have basically the same components. But when you get into expository or informational text, we've got 5, 6, some up to 7 different text structures that help organize the text. And we have to explicitly teach those structures so that students can use that information to help them understand what they read and organize what they read. Another aspect to reading comprehension that is very, very important, especially for students who have difficulty with language comprehension. These students might be on the spectrum or not, but they don't inference, and so that's something we have to explicitly teach them how to do. Another aspect of comprehension that we know is extremely important is this idea of questioning and answering questions and generating questions. Equally, if not more important, is getting them to generate their own questions and then helping students, and giving them, the students, opportunities to engage in discussions. Very, very important part of reading comprehension instruction is setting up conversations that actually engage all students. And then lastly on this slide, teaching strategies that include monitoring and summarizing. The strategy instruction can be very helpful if it's done in a way that gives the message to students that when we read, we apply 1, 2, or many strategies depending on what the text is saying. And what would we use to monitor some of the interventions that we're doing for comprehension? Again, we have these CBM measures. You have Easy CBM has the multiple choice reading comprehension. The DAYS is part of the DIBBLS. It's actually called, it's the DAYS, which is a maze procedure. And then Ames Web also monitors comprehension, reading comprehension. And then you have the CORE and a QRI and the DRA2, all measuring reading comprehension to monitor the student's progress. If that's your focus, if that's your area of focus, we want to make sure we're checking in to see if it's working. So we've come to the point now where we've got a lot of data, and what are we going to do with all this information? How are we going to take that information and use it to see if the students actually improved? So graphing allows us to quantify that rate of student improvement. We're looking for increasing scores that tell us that they are responding to intervention. This is the basis of response to intervention. Or the other scenario, which we don't like to see but we need to know, is the student flatlining or worse, going down, indicating unresponsiveness. So I have 2 really nice resources here, Easy CBM, Intervention Central, where you can actually not only design some of your interventions, actually at Intervention Central, you can design not your interventions but your assessments, and then they have data monitoring tools that you can use to look at the data. So what we're looking for is not this scenario, because this is showing a trend line that's lower than the aim line. So I can't point to the aim line as I tried to do earlier with my little little laser pointer, but the X and the dotted line is your aim line. And then you have your data points at 2 weeks, at 6 and 7 and 8 weeks that show, well actually even at 4 and 5, but connecting the trend line for this student. So we're looking at the aim line for where we want them to be at the end of 14 weeks of instruction, and the student isn't making adequate progress. So that second vertical line is showing, well, we're changing the instruction to accelerate the student's progress. You can see what would happen if you did that here. Okay, so let's talk for just a few minutes. We're almost at 11:15, where I'd like to stop and take more questions, but a little more information about setting up a database. Data management can be the bane of many teachers' existence, for sure. And if we don't do it in an effective, efficient way, it really makes the whole idea of data-driven assessment or data-driven intervention and instruction a nightmare. So I'm going to point you to two wonderful data management tools, both of which I've used, and they're very different, but I think they're both great. And what you're doing here is setting up the database so that you have procedures in place for collecting, for entering, and then sharing data. You're going to want to make sure first that you're training the staff on what those expectations are for collection and what those management procedures are. And I point you to two tools that I think will help with this, with developing this management system. The first is from Iris at Peabody, and hopefully this link works because they keep changing the link sometimes, but last we checked, this link should take you to the website, the Iris website. It's actually a great website that has a tremendous number of training modules, resources, etc. But this is going to take you to an RTI module, and you'll be able to scroll down to the bottom of the page and click on a link that will get you to that graphing tool. If it doesn't, just take that text right there, what it says, Student Progress Monitoring Tool for Data Collection and Graphing, and you can just add Iris or Peabody or Vanderbilt or all three, and it should get you to where you need to go. And it will give you an Excel spreadsheet, and it will give you a PDF that explains how to use that Excel spreadsheet. It's relatively straightforward, and what's nice about it is you have an Excel where you plug in the data, and then at the bottom of the Excel spreadsheet, you click on a link that actually converts that Excel data into a graph. So you don't have to graph it, you just have to put in the data. And not that that's a just, because I know that's considerable effort as well, but at least you don't have to create these graphs. And the second is a little more sophisticated, but same concept. That one comes from the National Center on Intensive Intervention. Again, an incredible place to go to find information about intervention, both academic and for those of you who work with students who need behavioral interventions. It's also a tremendous resource for students that need that you need to understand more, not just assessment, but what to do for students with behavioral needs. So this is an example of a graph that was created from that Iris website, and you can see the top is her aim line. We're looking at words read correctly, and then you can see her actual data starting on October 4th when she started her intervention for some of the things that we pointed to earlier, as we looked at her data and we looked at what she was doing to address her needs in the area of phonemic awareness and decoding and encoding. So after 7 weeks of instruction, not 7 weeks of instruction, but after about 2.5 months of instruction, her 7th data point, we see she went from reading 1 word correct per minute to reading 13 words correct per minute. We had given her a goal of 15 words correct per minute by the end of the year, starting her new year off with a target, and she's doing great. She's doing really well with good targeted instruction. So I want to end the webinar, at least this part of it, before we go into Q&A, just talking about how we are really, what I think the focus of this webinar has been is the role of the evaluator, whether, in this case we specifically focused on assessing students and digging deeper and getting to the root cause of the problem. I tried to touch a little bit on what interventions would match the assessment data, but we're really talking about here what is the going back to the title of our presentation, using the literacy screening data to support students. Okay, so what the quote is alluding to here is that the evaluator's knowledge of research on reading acquisition and reading difficulties is the actually the best reading assessment tool of all. And not only the knowledge of reading acquisition and reading difficulties, but in this case, knowing about assessment, knowing the different types of assessment and which ones are used when, where, and how is a big part of this puzzle. So I thank you again for spending time with me this morning. I know it's a big chunk of time. I hope it was valuable, and I know we have time for some more questions, which I'm happy to answer, and I'm sure Donna and Joanne will help me in addressing some of those questions.
That's great. Thank you so much, Margie. This has been a very content-rich webinar. We know there's a lot of information for people to digest and figure out what makes sense for them in their school or district. So we've divided the questions into two broad categories. We still have questions remaining regarding assessment, going back to the early screeners. And one of the first questions was how can we determine if a student has a reading disability based on an early screener? And so I would turn it over to Margie, because that really is the whole point of this
That is the
webinar.
whole point, yes, and it's a really important point, and the answer is you can't. Okay, so you cannot diagnose or identify, really identify is the word we prefer to use here, a student with dyslexia from that universal screening data. The whole point is to use it to learn more and to use it as it's been constructed to be used, which is really to identify students at risk. And from there, you dig deeper and you say, oh, I see this is a problem. And then from there you say, oh, this is such a problem, I need to probably go to, a PPT process. So it is a process, and it is a process that should include the experts, including, the classroom teacher and any reading interventionist, speech and language pathologist, if comprehension seems to be the area of need, whoever the people that should be at the table discussing what to do next.
Great, and we have some other assessment questions.
So one question here, do you think it's necessary to screen students prior to kindergarten? Why or why not? So I think it's a good idea to screen, but the question is how to screen and what screening. And because, again, I don't want to give the impression that assessment's it's so complicated, as you probably know even more after having listened to this for 2.5 hours. But at the same time, the whole idea of finding students at risk is the point of a screener. So we know the earlier we find these children at risk, the better able we can help them. And I don't mean by helping them, identifying them. Okay, that's really important. That pinning a label on a student isn't going to mean that they're going to get what they need. Does pinning a label on a student mean they have a chance at getting what they need? Yes, in most cases it does. So it's tricky though. So I don't want to identify a student and say, oh my gosh, red flag, get them to this, that, or the other help. That may be true, and you could find kids who are at risk. Certainly, we have kids in birth to 3 programs that are identified at age 1 or 2 for whatever reason. They have lots of, cognitive, physical, and, whatever it may be. But even I've used an assessment in a district this year, or actually for the past 2 years, in preschool, and it's really been incredibly valuable. We call it the baby dibbles. There are others out there, and what it's doing is helping the teachers find the kids early who need targeted instruction. It's not the whole answer. It doesn't address social, emotional. It doesn't look at other aspects of early learning, but it certainly looks at some risk factors that can be, and in many cases need to be, identified for those students who are going to need to catch up. where, especially children who are not provided lots of enrichment in those early years, and we know from Hart and Risley's research, they're way behind their peers when they enter kindergarten. So, there are good reasons to look at these children early.
I agree with you, Margie. I think we should be looking at them. I think people have to understand that phonological awareness tests or tasks for preschoolers are highly metalinguistic.
Yes.
And so you have to be sure you understand what you're actually measuring for the child. And it's not simply a question of whether the child can follow the directions or not.
You're
That's
right.
the way it gets translated.
You're right.
But if a child is not metalinguistic, is not at that stage yet, your assessment data in those early phonological awareness tasks are not valid.
Yeah,
So.
it's a very good point.
And the other thing to think about too is that for the assessments that we're talking about using, it indicates, that these assessments are appropriate for, mid-year grade K and beyond, maybe to grade 8, or some are appropriate for beginning of grade K to grade 6. So that's an indication there. And clearly, people aren't misusing assessments, meaning off grade level going down to pre-K. My point is, when you take a look at the research, as you were saying, Donna, that there are reasons why we want to begin certain assessments at certain ages or grades, and
Yep.
we have to keep that in mind.
Yep. Yeah, somebody just asked, what's the baby DIBELS? It's the preschool early learning indicator. So if you go to DIBELS or type in PELI,
Perfect. Yes.
yeah, you'll find information about that.
Alrighty, let's see if we can field
Okay,
a few more
so
of
a
these
few more.
assessment questions, and then we have some specific questions about Jessica.
Okay.
So,
Okay, happy to go there. So why not give informal reading assessment first, followed by a formal assessment to dig deeper? No reason not to. As I showed you, Jessica's reading, running record, informal reading inventory is often the DRA that includes a running record. So it's absolutely, I just can be considered a diagnostic assessment as opposed to a screener, and I just wanted to differentiate that. All right, another question. Can the formal assessments be administered prior to referral, since many discussed are part of the formal evaluation process? Yeah, and the answer is yes, they can. And it sometimes will accelerate the process of identification if those are done, and there's no reason not to. They're going to give you diagnostic information that's going to help you get instruction that works for those students. Great thing to do, and as I said, and then you have that data that you go to the PPT with if in fact you do go to a referral. Notice I do want to mention that assessment resource guide does have multiple options for each reading area, so please take a look at that. It's very comprehensive. Louise Spear-Swirling, who we know is a wonderful collaborator and partner with us, helped develop the great list, and most of those assessments, by the way, are available at the SERC library, which is great because you could come and check. Actually, Donna's telling me they're all available, so come and check them out if you want to see, take them for a test drive, and then see if you want those for your district. Another question, interested in viewing core assessments, but don't see it listed in the, it's in the list. It is not a screener, okay? It is an excellent resource. It is not a screener. I've kept referring to it as a diagnostic, right? There's a set of diagnostic assessments. There may be a couple things in there like the oral reading fluency assessments, but it's not considered a screener. It would not be on our approved list as such. Okay, what are best tools to assess comprehension in addition to DIBELS, and what are other districts using? So DIBELS, it does have a DAYS, so it does assess comprehension, but it doesn't assess comprehension in the way that I think, again, if you suspect a comprehension problem, it doesn't assess it in the way that I think assessment should and can be assessed diagnostically. That's why I really love the QRI, because that does give you great information about comprehension. And I know a lot of districts that I've worked with use the QRI for those students who we need more information about in terms of comprehension.
So Margie, we have about 5 or 6 minutes left, and we wanted to shift from assessment. We have a few more questions in assessment, but we wanted to shift to the topic of specifically Jessica's intervention. So people had questions about giving a little bit more specificity about what was done. Was the intervention provided by a general ed teacher? The frequency of the intervention. So if you could talk to that a little bit.
I'm happy to, because Jessica was a true success story and is a success story. She still needs, a lot of instruction, and so I guess, the specific questions had to do with what was the intervention and who provided it. It was a Tier 2 intervention, and it was provided by a highly skilled interventionist who really knows her stuff, especially, with regard to phonological processing difficulties. It was very explicit in terms of phonemic awareness instruction. It included a very specific scope and sequence. I mean, she's at the very beginning of it. She's still reading closed syllable words. But, it really does have that very explicit aspect to it, following a lot of the principles that I did not describe in detail. But again, if you download that structured literacy PDF, you'll see what those principles are. It was delivered every single day for 45 minutes a day. So, she really did get targeted instruction. I believe she was in the group with one other student. That student was really matched to her profile. They needed the same and basic instruction, and they're both making progress with it. So that's a little bit more about Jessica. Those are all important questions. Another question here with regard to intervention: what role does independent practice play in reading here? Our district relies heavily on independent reading time. Okay, that's a great question, and every student, particularly students who struggle with reading, need to practice. My main problem with independent practice time is that the students who struggle and are told to independently practice are often not independently practicing because they can't read and they don't like to read. So as long as you're assured that the students are reading during that independent practice time, that's okay. So that means you have to have some kind of accountability built into that, whatever that may look like, whatever that may be. Otherwise, there is no research to support having time for independent reading, particularly if the kids cannot do it very well. So just be thinking about that. Instructional time in schools, most school days are 6 hours, and if you look at the instructional time for literacy, it's like 2 hours a day maybe. Because you have all the other things you have to teach. So if you have 90 minutes or 120 minutes for literacy, for those students who struggle, we have to make sure that every minute is counting. And I don't mean to say, oh my gosh, the kid can't breathe and he shouldn't be practicing. He or she should, but as I say, a lot of times that's not happening. What is a word network? A word network is a network of words that are associated with a vocabulary word that you're specifically choosing to teach a student, usually is associated with a content. So if you're teaching habitat, for example, there are many words associated with that word habitat, and you just do a visual word splash so that you can see how those words are interconnected and related to one another. Many slides say Tier 2. What about Tier 3 in special ed? As a special ed teacher, I'm going to stop there. When I use Tier 2, I often would say that pretty much everything I said applies to Tier 3. So everybody has a different way of proceeding through a multi-tier system of support in their schools and districts, but certainly everything that I really talked about today would apply to Tier 3 in special education. However, in this particular webinar where we were really trying to focus our attention is you have this universal screening information as a classroom teacher, as a member of a PPT team, and you need to know what next, because the students either in the yellow or red zone on those screeners, and we need to dig a little deeper. Okay.
All right, Margie, we're right at the end of our time. I did want to mention that many of the intervention approaches that Margie talked to in a brief way today, she speaks about in much greater detail in an online course we have that we've collaborated with the State Department on, called Research to Practice, with lots of examples in there. So if you want to dig deeper on your own into the area of intervention, you'll find some of those answers there. We're going to end with just one question that I think is sort of the $64,000 question here. Someone asked, could we label Jessica as having phonological processing problems, but stop short of using the term SLD dyslexia unless she becomes special ed? And I think that's really the heart and soul of this webinar, that it's about students with reading difficulties. So in this case, Jessica is responding to the intervention, which is what we need to do within general ed.
Right. I agree with that, and we have to find out where Jessica goes as time goes on, and keep looking at the data and looking at, have we closed the gap on not just one or two measures, but ultimately, can she read text fluently? That's really the acid test, and we don't know. I didn't share, a lot of that because of time. It was really more to illustrate an example. I have a hunch, but it remains to be seen.
Okay. Thank you so much, Margie. We appreciate all your efforts as our presenter, and we appreciate our collaboration with the State Department of Ed and our SERC tech team, who are behind the scenes, are bringing everything to you. We do have some unanswered questions, and we will think about some ways to respond to those. Thank you to everyone who's participated, and look for an evaluation coming through your email. And we will stay online and field more questions and just take note of them. But our webinar is concluded, and thank you for joining us.